Good morning, everybody. Just do a sound check. Can you hear me in the room? Yeah. And can we hear us online? Awesome. Fantastic. So, good morning, everybody. My name is Jason Cripps. I'm the president and CEO of the Alberta Forest Products Association. Super excited to have you here. I thought Dr. Hesberg set us off in a very good way this morning with a great presentation. For those online that missed it, just really talked about the importance of more active wildfire interface. So I'm really looking forward to our dialogue this morning. Just a little bit of background for myself. I've been the president and CEO of the Alberta Forest Products Association for 5 years. Before that, I was with the provincial government of Alberta for almost 20 years, deputy minister for 2 different departments, economic development and trade, before that ag and forestry. The former department, economic development and trade, actually was a massive partner for Pinmar. So I've known Pinmar for some time, and it's just an amazing platform that we continue to see now 34 years in the books of the cross-border dialogue. And there's no better platform in my mind to have a conversation about something that knows no borders, and that's wildfire. And so I'm really looking forward to the conversation this morning. So the association that I'm a part of represents all of the active forest manufacturing companies in the province of Alberta. That's sawmilling to wood pellets to pulp paper and everything from the multinationals like a West Fraser or Canfor that are active on both sides of the Canada-US border to smaller independent companies in Northern Alberta as well. So, but this morning, we're really going to be talking about roots, resilience, intersection of wildfire, forest management, and community. We've got a great number of speakers lined up to have a conversation with us this morning. Each will be providing about 4 or 5 or 6 minutes worth of open comments, and then we're going to just have an open dialogue and lots of questions. I invite you to hit the questions on the Whova app. Looking forward to having that dialogue here this morning. So I'm just going to do a quick round of introductions and then going to hand it off to our first speaker, Cody. But those in the room would have already heard Dr. Hesberg, professor at University of Washington School of Environmental and Forest Science, senior research ecologist and Pacific Northwest Research Station, formerly with the USDA Forest Service from 1984 to 2024. So Dr. Paul. We also have online virtually Cody, and I apologize, Cody, I'm probably going to mispronounce your last name, but I've heard from others that it's important about the attempt. So I'm going to attempt it. DeSalto, is that how you? Close? Not even close.
Close.
DeSalto?
Yep.
Okay. My apologies, Cody. Cody's the executive director for the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation and president of the Intertribal Timber Council. We also have Christine Beveridge, who's the chief administrative officer for the town of Edson. We have Dr. Jennifer Grants, who's principal investigator for Indigenous-led lab. And closing out and batting cleanup will be Keith Heikla, who's government affairs, American Forest Research Council. Keith is in the room, but he'll provide a bit of closing comments and a call to action after we've heard from the great speakers and have had an interactive dialogue with all of you. So without further ado, I'm going to actually hand the mic and the podium virtually over to Cody. Cody, to you.
Sure, and thank you. So just got a few slides to help set context for the conversation this morning. Everybody see my screen all right? All right, so, I see your, are we good?
We're good.
Okay.
We're just doing a volume adjustment here, Cody, on the volume here in the room.
Oh, gotcha. Are we loud enough?
Got a little better, folks?
Try it again.
A mic check, Cody.
Any better now?
Probably about the same, but if you don't mind just speaking a little bit louder, we should be able to roll.
Okay. So tribal perspective on fire resilience, and this comes not from just our current day experience, but what we know we did historically through time. So pre-contact, there would have been a lot of tribes scattered across, well, all of the Americas, but in particular the area I'm looking at in the Northwest that would have used fire quite frequently for a number of different things. whether that was to improve cultural plant and medicine production, to manage habitat for big game species that they would have harvested for subsistence purposes, to maintain healthy riparian areas, and a variety of other things that may have included some of those cultural or spiritual activities the tribes would have conducted. So we know that there was frequent use of fire in a lot of very deliberate ways across the West. Transition into contact, a significant reduction in tribal populations due to disease. Based on some of the more current research, they think that number may be as high as 80 to 95% of tribal people, particularly in the West, died from disease even prior to first contact when Lewis and Clark would have came west. And as we've seen over the last several hundred years, increasing populations, changing land use patterns, changing ownership, and a checkerboard that leaves us with the condition we have today. That combined with about a century of very successful fire suppression has left us with a condition on the landscape that's led to the huge catastrophic wildfires that we've seen for the last couple decades, in combination with climate change and a number of other things. So when we look at the tribal perspective, and I'm primarily focusing on Colville here, but this is true of a lot of tribes, that were really focused on managing the landscape for ecosystem function and resilience, whether that be resilience to insect, disease, or fire. And when we look at tribal priorities for management, we're very focused on what those ecosystem functions are. So clean water, clean air, big game habitat, foods and medicines that perpetuate our cultures and support our people's subsistence needs. And I've got a few pictures in the next couple slides to help illustrate that. And one thing I should probably add is that when we think about fire, we understand that these are fire adapted ecosystems, that fire should be present. It should happen fairly frequently, but ideally under the right conditions. So when we look at our management goals and objectives, we're trying to achieve really post-burn conditions that are more consistent with what we would have seen historically. So recognizing there's going to be some low, moderate, and high severity fire, but we want those to be in the right proportions. And maybe this will go. Okay. So looking at Colville, we've got a very active fire management and forest management program that goes back really decades. But despite that, the picture to the top right is our fire history just through a 6-year span, and we've had at least one big fire since. So in the previous decade, we have burned 800,000 acres of a 1.4 million acre reservation. There's been some positive post-fire impacts and some negative post-fire impacts. So I've got a couple of those illustrations on the screen. The top left is one of those high severity conditions that we're trying to avoid, but understand those are going to happen in certain wildfire conditions, and understand that those are also natural processes, resetting those stands, resetting those successional stages. We just want to ensure that those are in fairly small patch sizes, so the landscape is still producing all of those other things that are important to our tribal membership. And then the lower center picture is one of those successful outcomes that we've seen. So this is from a fire we had last year that I'll show you a bark map for that really looks at fire severity. But this is what we're looking for in much of, particularly those low elevation forest types, where you can have fire, not have those catastrophic post-fire impacts, and really function as it should in the landscape naturally, where it's consuming fuel, it's raising canopy base height, and what the post-fire condition looked like is really better than what it was pre-fire. And the next one, some of the ways that we achieve that is doing active forest management, trying to return those stands to something that would have been more consistent with what would have been on the landscape historically. So fewer trees, larger, older trees of the right species composition that is resilient to insect, disease, and fire. We do that with a combination of logging treatments and field treatments. So the upper right is us, after treating one of those stands with a forest health treatment, going back in after the fact and doing some prescribed burning to further reduce those fuels in the understory, to reduce that post-fire effect once we get a wildfire on those landscapes. And then a very successful example of what we saw just last year in 2024, this is the Swalwilla fire. So when we look at that map in the lower right, that's really showing what fire severities were in that fire. So the red is high severity fire, going to the light and dark green that are either low severity or unburned areas. So what we saw in that fire in 53,000 acres was only 2.8% of it burned in high severity. And 65% of that fire burned in low severity or was unburned altogether. So when we think about fire at Colville, this is really what we're trying to focus our management towards. How do we create resilience on the landscape so that you can have fire in these fire adapted ecosystems and not have post-fire conditions that are outside what the historic range of variability would have been? Those landscapes are still providing all of those things that are important for our tribal membership. And with that, I'll pass it off to whoever's next.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Cody. Great overview, and looking forward to rounding us out here. Dr. Paul, we'll go with you next. Seems to be. Is this working okay? Yeah, so I've got one slide. Gerda is going to bring it up.
Yes. Thank you for your patience, guys.
I'll start by saying that the return of fire during the 21st century is imminent. So our goal is to be able to live with it safely. And we don't get to vote on whether or not fire is coming back. We get to choose the kind of fire we get to live with. We get to choose the kind of smoke. And the good news is we have a ton of tools that we can apply. The wildfire space, go ahead and click through all of them. This is the last slide of my talk this morning. And the thing that binds all these issue areas together is an active fire regime. So what we have right now is a fire regime in every forest type that is an anomaly. And one of the things that's getting balanced right now is the lack of fire. A fire deficit is now being changed by fires basically of chance rather than fires of choice. Our indigenous people had fires of choice. They essentially apprehended fire as a tool and they used it to live safely on the landscape. We must too. And so I would say these areas right here are all influenced by the return of active good fire on the landscape. We can actually change, for example, I'll start at the bottom, the likelihood of severe landslides, mass failures, and flooding. That is associated with severe fire by bringing non-severe fire back to the landscape. We don't get the hydrophobic soils, so we don't get the big hill slope processes firing. Water capture and distribution infrastructure is about 70% on forest lands. That's where the cool, clear, sustainable water supply comes from. And so how we gather and distribute water is very much influenced by the severity of fire. We can actually change how that part of the system works by bringing the right kind of fire back. Restoring forest health and resilience. What I said in my talk earlier, and I'll say it again, is our forests are a life support system. We don't think about it, we've commodified it, but it's actually a life support system. It's where clean air, clean water, those kinds of things actually come from. So inviting good fire and lower smoke levels by prescription is a great way for us to move forward. We can protect power transmission and distribution in ways that we're not by literally bringing fire back into the landscape so that rights of way are now places where fires go to die rather than jump across the rights of way. Working with partner landowners in order to be able to thin the forests adjacent to rights of way so fires are on the ground and they can be potentially attacked. Right now, insurance companies and reinsurance companies are calling the ball. They're pulling their book out of a lot of different towns, neighborhoods, jurisdictions right now. Doesn't have to be that way. We can keep people insured by having them ready to go for fire, but we have to incentivize it. We have to help. Like Cody said, we need to bring Western and Indigenous knowledge systems and practices. What we're learning by working with them right now, managers and practitioners and Indigenous scientists, is that it would be a superpower for us to work together. They know so much about specific places. It's place-based knowledge system. Greenhouse gases are creating a warming right now. We can actually have a huge influence on the rate of warming. Right now, wildfires are warming the warming at a fantastically high rate.
So capturing how would these wildfires influence, harnessing that into better fire will significantly reduce that aspect. You can see that sort of the central switching station, the nexus point, is a fire regime, harnessing an active fire regime that allows us to be able to live safely, peacefully, healthily with fire in the landscape. We're not being given an alternative of not doing that now in the 21st century.
All right, thanks very much, Paul. Next, we're going to turn to Christine Beveridge, who's the Chief Administrative Officer for the town of Edson, and her community dealt with both wildfire and floods in the year 2023. So Christine's going to give us a sense of how they dealt with it and the preparation going forward. Christine?
Thank you very much, Jason. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. It's so yes, as Jason just mentioned, joining the town of Edson 4 years ago, I had no idea of what joining a forest community was going to, how it was going to change me. In 25 years in municipal government, I've served many municipalities across the province, but no communities actually had this type of topographic around me. And with that, I had no idea of what the risks were. I don't think our community did realize the impact either. We hadn't actually had a fire previously. It had been decades since we'd had any type of a fire that maybe was near our community. And in 2023, that all changed. I can remember the day that we had Alberta Wildfire contacted myself and the DEM and a few of my other senior members of my team and asked for us to come and meet them at the fire hall. The fire was, at our doorstep, basically, or, at that point already. Later that day, we evacuated the town. It was probably the most incredible experience that I've ever went through. My team, we joined up with the Yellowhead County as well. So doing this with another community was also added another facet to our unique situation. And Yellowhead County is much more positioned as far as their emergency preparedness, as well as they just had more resources. So we joined our ECCs together. That was a very quick decision that the CAO and I had made very quickly. And as I said, we evacuated the community within 7 hours of being told that this fire was going to potentially breach our community. With that, I can say my organization was not prepared. My community was not prepared. But we successfully, evacuated with no injuries to residents, etc. And we felt like it went fairly well. However, even during the evacuation, there was times where because of fire was surrounding our community, so there was fire to the south as well as fire to the north, and then also to the east. So Highway 16, which is a main corridor in Alberta, if you're familiar, was closed. We actually had to route people through the Jasper Way. So through that, what I learned, probably most, you don't do this alone. We had Alberta Emergency Management Agency fire departments around the world that came to support our community. And it changed us. It changed my organization. It changed the way we've created, a business area, which, to be fair, it wasn't there. It was something that we hadn't really focused or paid attention to enough, given the risks that were around our community. From that, so that was the first fire. We had the second fire a month later, and then a flood. We asked our residents to come back on a Friday, and our community flooded on Sunday. So I would much rather deal with flood than a fire. It's much different. It feels a lot different. Just the pace and the I think the risk, as far as long as life safety is not an issue, because it goes away. That's for me, that's something that I took with me. Just, I think from that point in 2023, we had to reset as an organization and get serious about mitigation efforts, get serious about emergency preparedness, and really understand how this was going to affect our organization and how we were going to have to help our elected officials understand the seriousness of what we needed to do in a way of resources, and also to continue our advocacy efforts with the provincial government with regards to the disaster recovery program and what we needed to see in order to support communities. Given that my organization is, essentially we have a $35 million budget. It's not, an extensive budget where when you're having to deal with emergencies in the way that we did, we weren't prepared for that either. So having to expend the amount of money we had to in a very short period of time was very challenging. With regards to a little bit about recovery, what I can say is PTSD is absolutely real. It's something I really didn't understand it at the time. And a year later, I realized that it was very real for me. It changed me. And so it's something I've had to deal with, and I see it in my staff. I see it in our community. As soon as there is any type of smoke, we are very conscious of it. We make sure our community is very well informed of what the risk is. We recently had a fire, actually, of our warehouse or OSB mill last week, and it filled my community with smoke, and people were absolutely panicked. And so I think, with our mitigation efforts, very clearly, fire smarting our community, continually working at, trying to get grants to help with that has been a challenge. Also, we've done some prescribed burning, which is something that we hadn't done for a very long time in this region, and it was actually frowned upon. And so we did it this year, and it took me, to be fair, it took me a lot of time to actually agree to it based on my own concern of risk for the community, but knowing that it was going to be, a beneficial mitigating effort, it worked out fine, but it was hard. It's just some of those efforts, as well as working towards fire guarding our community, and also when it comes to the efforts that we've made to create relationships with our industry, create relationships with the provincial government to help understand how we can navigate through these requirements that we need to be aware of, is something that is a key focus area. And as I mentioned, with my council, they are very supportive. Having lived through this, I think it makes it easier, but it doesn't give a blank check towards, you still have other responsibilities. So we always have to balance how far we go, because I can tell you in 2023, I wanted to take all the trees down all around the community. So that's just a little bit about Edson and what we experienced there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Christine, for sharing that very live and real experience. Next up as a speaker is Dr. Jennifer Grenz, who will give us her perspective from Indigenous-led.
Yadakshin Wenman, good morning. My name's Jennifer Grenz. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Forest Resources Management at UBC and a member of the Lytton First Nation. And my lab is working extensively on wildfire recovery these days, alongside communities left standing in the ashes. And I think all of my colleagues that have spoken prior to me have kind of hit a lot of similar notes of what we're dealing with. But I want to focus a little bit on, the hope that can come from these fires and the opportunities for us to address some of the policy and practice issues that are in our way of achieving, some of these things that my colleagues have spoken about, prescribed burning, cultural burning, how we don't end up in this mess again, because, what's happening in my own Inclicatmic territory in the interior of British Columbia and the neighboring territories. I work extensively in the neighboring territories, Stadtholm territory near Lillooet, is that, we have some systemic changes that need to happen to enable us to manage lands differently. And this is where we need politicians at all levels, government staff, all of that to be brave and make some changes, because, we're kind of, challenged by a problem that none of us, I think, went to school and learned about, right? Is like, how do you start ecosystems over again in these catastrophic wildfires? This is on the McKay Creek wildfire, 11 kilometers north of Lillooet in the interior of BC, was a 46,000 hectare fire. We're now at year 4 in the post-wildfire. But, a little bit of hope that comes with it is that in many parts of this fire, the fire did exactly what fire is supposed to do. It's supposed to stop encroachment. This is how we, used it in terms of Inclicatmic fire stewardship, to keep grasslands open. These are incredibly important to not just wildlife like mule deer, but also our ranchers. In British Columbia, ranching is a significant industry for us, and these grasslands also feed those cattle. And encroachments become a huge issue with sagebrush, with conifers creeping down the mountainsides. So, I think this is a really beautiful picture, and I don't want to take away from the trauma that's been caused by these fires, because that is very real. We lost community members in the Lytton fire, but there are, we can take lessons from these fires. This is a reckoning on the last 150 plus years of forest management in the Pacific Northwest. But last week I was out on the land with some community members and students. And, if you look at this picture, your first reaction might be to see devastation. But if you apply a different lens, all I see here is hope. There's food everywhere on these landscapes. So this area was like a monotypic stand of just coniferous trees planted densely through forestry operations in the past. And now these areas, the memory in the land, the seed banks in the land are showing us like these were berry producing areas. We have all of these issues with food security in our communities. We have issues with, our wildlife not doing well. And all of a sudden the land is providing. And, there were so many species of berries out there. It was absolutely incredible. And these are just some of the examples. Berry sizes have increased, since this, like the elders have told us all along. Plants that we haven't seen on the landscape are coming back. Yes, there are some areas where we're needing to help that along for sure, but there's a new type of abundance and diversity showing up on the lands to remind us that perhaps planting trees everywhere is not the solution, and perhaps some of these areas, trees don't belong, and historical ecology tells us that. And so I guess this is my major point, this morning in these few minutes that I have is, as much as, we're getting, trying to integrate Indigenous knowledges into things, turning to prescribed burning, thinning, all of these things to make our communities safer, we are still up against systems that are meant to perpetuate themselves. I've worked extensively with government, and it just keeps going how it's supposed to go. And industry is the same way. There's no one person standing at the top saying, hey, we need to stick a stick in these spokes for a minute and maybe think differently about the policies that shape our forest practices and how we plan around communities on a landscape level. For instance, also helping everyone to understand the difference between what is a forest and what is a tree plantation. Because as we've been seeking, controls for our, we're studying what happens after wildfire, looking at vegetation, and we were told, well, you need to find a control, like an unburned area to compare to that is, ultimately the restoration goal. And everywhere that we go, especially in the interior, there's no such thing, because all they are is dense stands of 1 or 2 species planted, very tightly where you can't even walk underneath the forest because the fuel load is so high, it's dry, it's hot underneath the tree canopy. And, these are the fires of chance, like my colleague just said, these are tinder boxes that are just waiting to go because we forgot what a forest is and applied saying that a tree plantation is a forest. And I am not anti-forestry. Resource use is part of my culture, but we have to start being clear about differentiating between the two things and thinking about what is close to where people live and how we are balancing that, because we need to be thinking about the diversity and food opportunities and wildlife opportunities and just, not losing what has been created by some of these fires. Because what we're seeing right now, and this is also on the McKay Creek fire, is out of nowhere, tree seedlings are being planted by forestry companies at high density straight into the ash. And we don't even know how this happened. We have working groups with different stakeholders involved, and all of a sudden, boom, an entire hillside is planted with 2, maybe 3 species of coniferous trees straight into ash at high density. And all I can see is the perpetuation of this problem, that we're planting the next generation's fires just because the status quo is the easiest thing for us to do. And this is where we need help at the policy level to stop this from happening. Like, yes, we want to replant for forestry in certain areas, but we have to start asking bigger questions about, is this area the right area for that? Is it too close to a community? Is it too close to things that are important to other values than forestry, like ranching, like our cultural sites, like wildlife? And so, we've come together with alongside community to start to, heal lands, but really what we're doing is confronting values constantly. And I just want to leave this with one example, where we talk about prescribed burning, where we say that we want to include Indigenous stewardship, but policy is in the way of that. And one example is mule deer. Mule deer species where their winter range is protected in British Columbia. And we had a community that wanted to do thinning and cultural burning to reduce wildfire risk around their community after a near miss from another fire. And they can't do it because the policy to protect the mule deer winter range stops them from actually being able to steward their lands. And there's examples of this everywhere. And so I think our challenge is we have to go through and find the policies that are planting the next generation's fires, perpetuating these problems and stopping us from doing, having a relationship with fire again. So they are fires of choice. I really love that so much. And so I just wanted to also leave you with that we did a couple of episodes alongside the Northern Statlium communities that were on CBC Ideas. And so, you can also hear a little bit more from community perspectives about what these fires mean, what has happened, and what they're hoping to see happens next. So I'll leave it at that, Cooks Jemik. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jennifer Kearns. Really appreciate this. And there's obviously some common themes woven amongst all of the speakers. I hear Paul talk about fire as a chance versus fire of choice. We've heard about prescribed burning. I've got a few questions here that I'm going to kick this off, but I absolutely invite you to use the Hula app to ask questions of our esteemed colleagues and panelists here. We've got a great set of skill sets around the table and virtually. So I'd like to dig into make sure that this is an audience participation type panel. So maybe the first one is to Cody, and then ask Jen and Paul or Christine to follow up if they have any supplemental. But what activities or treatments have Indigenous communities or tribes tried to reduce fire risk and impacts?
So like I mentioned earlier, we use a combination of both forest health and fuels treatment. So when we look at forest management, we're trying to restore the appropriate stocking, species composition, canopy base heights, all of those things that would have been on the landscape in the past. And because there's been fire suppression at the level it has been for the last at least century in the Northwest, many of those stands you can't use fire in the same way that we used to. So it takes some type of mechanical treatment first to prepare those stands for a subsequent prescribed fire, which then reduces the remainder of those fuels and significantly reduces the risk. So it really depends on the situation, but in most cases, for us at least, it's a combination of both mechanical, either fuels treatments or forest health treatments, and then a subsequent prescribed fire.
Thanks, Cody. Jen or Paul or Christine, any follow-up on that?
I couldn't make out the question. It's a little bit hard to understand what you're saying. It's kind of garbled for us. So I don't know if I don't see a chat section, but it might be helpful at least to be able to read the questions then, or yeah, anyway, sorry. I didn't hear the question.
No problem. Can you hear me now? Is that better?
It's just the quality of the sound is like, I don't know that it can be improved with the setup. I'm sorry to say, but we'll do our best.
Sounds like it's a tech issue. So we'll work on that, and maybe I'll just have Paul give any supplemental on what you said.
It's a great example of how grading practices and knowledge systems produces a super benefit. Cody basically said we're thinning and burning, we're getting some fiber resources to cover the treatment, but at the same time, it's putting light on the ground, it's awakening a fire-dependent community, which our Indigenous folks relied on since time immemorial. So it's not only great culture for the forest, but also improves traditional relationships with the land. It restores culture. Burning and traditional foods and sovereignty with traditional foods are important things. So instead of being at odds with each other, they work incredibly well together. And there's example after example of this joining creating a full benefit rather than different.
Very much meeting Indigenous knowledge with Western practices, making sure that they coexist together. So maybe, Christine, I'm just going to do an audio check. Can you hear? Is the audio okay for you?
It's the same, I would say, as what Jennifer mentioned. It's really hard to hear, so I'm just trying to be very mindful and listening very closely.
Okay.
Put the owl by you, because then you can have the owl mic. Instead of using the owl trying to pick up what you're saying.
Christine, how's that? Can you hear me now?
Yes, much better.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. This is troubleshooting from the audience. I love it. I love it. Fantastic. So Christine, this one's for you. How can local government build stronger community trust and engagement in proactive emergency preparedness efforts across the region?
Thank you, Jason. I think frequent education, being transparent with your community, ensuring, I think that's become something we did really well, I would say, with communication even during emergencies, and that really hasn't stopped. We've engaged our public early to learn what we could have done better. But even since then, I would say that in order to, continually provide for the information, we don't hide anything from our residents or our businesses. Essentially, we really try hard to be very transparent of what's actually going on. And I mentioned, last week of a situation where we needed to be forthcoming with them. When it comes to further, enhancement of our proactiveness, it's really that collaboration. We've met with industry more than, I have in any other, other situation now with regards to this, and early. So we meet in the wintertime when the risk is low. We talk about, okay, how can we further enhance our communication with them? It's just about sitting around the table and also understanding who everyone is. And it's much easier to make a call to someone in an emergency situation when you've actually had a conversation and have a face to the name. And I think that, you know, that was, you know, that was a really key thing that we've done. And further than that is quite literally is reaching out to our regional partners and creating a strategy where we've always known that they would always be there for us. But I don't think a person understands when fire hits your or is near your community. So luckily, you know, I have to say, I feel very blessed that we were not, you know, we didn't have damage to our community. But the reality is that we've got strategies in place. We're talking much more frequently about what we can do together. Our one thing that I just want to talk about a little bit is that you know, our DEM does monthly ECC meetings with our organization, and we're expanding that out to do regional training, in-house training for our region, to be able to take the ICS 100, 200, 300, and make it easy. So we all understand the risks in our communities, and there are different in our area. So I think that's been a huge advancement in our proactive approach. And you know, being open to hearing feedback from everyone that wants to share feedback with how we can do potentially improve is something that we're really open to. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine. Still just gonna do a mic check. Can you folks online hear us okay? Much better, excellent. So Jen, this next one's for you. Are you seeing changes to forestry practices and policies in response to these megafowl realities? And there's some legislators, municipal leaders in the room. What would you recommend for them and to them?
So no, nothing is changing. Absolutely not. And that has to change because, you know, and I'll maybe give you another example. Like we just did a legislative review of the impacts of major climate events on mule deer habitat. This is a land-based protein source that's extremely important, not just to the Indigenous communities, but many rural communities that exist alongside them. You know, people living outside the city tend to fill their freezers with land-based protein, you know, just the same as our communities do as well. But we are in a reality now where we have fires next to fires, fires on top of fires. And the legislation that applies to mule deer management in our province has no mechanism to respond to major climate events to change what's happening. So as an example, if you've got forestry operations right up against the side of a fire, all those animals have nowhere to go, right? They're going to be displaced over into these other habitat areas. We have no legislative mechanism to say a fire just occurred, so we are going to halt operations and reassess what can happen next to these fires, right? So what we're having right now is we have catastrophic fire. We have all this displacement of the animals that actually survived and left, and they can put a cut block right beside the fire. So we have to create legislative mechanisms that allow us to pivot, right? To allow us to even hit a pause button so that we can look at the landscape as a whole and make decisions about what activities can continue and what need to stop. And another example of that is cattle back on range after fire. So there's also an immediate pressure. The BC Cattlemen's Association, who I'm an agrologist by trade, so I have some alliances there. They're a very powerful lobby to our government, but they got to feed their cows, and this is so we got to get them back on the land. And meanwhile, they're assessing vegetation to see if there's enough out there for the cattle, but they're not thinking about the other animals out there because that's never had to be part of the equation before. And so these are examples of all these holes. So I hear all this hopeful chatter like, oh, we're learning so much or whatever, but we're still using the same legislation, the same policies for a completely different reality. And we're going to make things and are making things so much worse by just not having these mechanisms to hit a pause button, to stop something, to say, okay, now here's how we're going to assess things instead, considering these realities. So there is a lot of work that has to be done at the policy level. And I think there's so much risk aversion in government. You don't want to tick anybody off. You're trying to get reelected. I totally understand it. My husband's a politician. I get it. I ran for office once. I understand, but it is going to take brave people to do the right thing. And I cannot emphasize that enough. We have to reassess all of these pieces of legislation. We have to create emergency measures that allow us to reassess on a landscape level. Because as an example, in St'át'imc territory, there have been more fires in the last 20 years in that territory than there was over the last 100. And I wish I put the map on, because we also have on our map layers all the forestry activities happening through the fire and around it. I mean, there's nowhere for animals to go. There's nowhere, so that's where I'm hoping that, people in that room, like, help us help you.
Awesome. Thanks, Jen. Good call to action. Jody or Paul, any supplemental on that?
Just one idea. Can you hear me okay? One idea that Jennifer said is really worth underscoring. Let me ask a question of all of you. How many of you have lived through a climate change before? This is my first climate change, right? Probably yours as well. And the things that we did to get here are not the solution sets. We literally have to start becoming experimental. We have to try new stuff and see what works and keep it. And in the Indigenous space, time and time again, what we're seeing is the things that are important to their cultural traditions are important to adapting climate change and adapting forests to fire. So, looking backwards and saying we always did this and it always worked, that's not going to solve the riddles that are in front of us. It's actually new stuff, new thinking, new combinations of ideas, new combinations of people that are going to be required going forward. And I can't underscore that enough. We keep doubling down on old stuff, and the remedies don't live there going forward in the 21st century. So.
If I can add to that, because right on, Paul, preach. But we also need to not allow climate to be the sole villain of the story, because solutions don't live there either. That is a scapegoat of convenience. Yes, the climate is changing, absolutely. But there are a myriad of other factors, related to land management over the last 150 plus years that have gotten us here. And so if we're only coming at this from a climate perspective, we're also going to lose out on opportunities to generate not just new ways of thinking, but new ways of creating sustainability for communities, addressing things like food security. Resiliency lives in these new solutions, but we can't sort of get ourselves into a corner thinking that all we're battling against right now is climate.
Thanks, Jen. Cody, any supplemental?
I agree with all the comments. I think that what the solutions look like going forward are going to be different than what we did in the past. And I think something we've failed to do is look at forest management from something other than an extractive perspective. Throughout my forestry career, we were focused on how many board feet we could produce and not necessarily resilience, or not necessarily what forest management or adaptations we needed to account for that were important for other ecosystem functions. So when we see these massive disturbance events on the landscape, what are the impacts to water quality? What are the recovery timelines? And I think that's something we're not doing a very good job at, is assessing risk and the timeline associated with mitigating or recovering from those massive fires that we're seeing. What we see in the US is prioritization of life and property, which does make sense, but when you're spending a disproportionate amount of time defending a $2 million vacation home, is that really more important in the grand scheme of things and in the long term than the upper parts of a watershed that are feeding a municipality that's dependent on that water? I think we're just we need to do a better job with evaluating what the true impacts are, and it's not just those impacts to people that we should be considering.
Thanks, Cody. We're just doing a mic test. Can you folks hear us with the mics now? Awesome. Great troubleshooting happening here in the audience and up front here, Tara. Thank you. Christine, Cody just talked about assessing risk from a community perspective. Obviously, coming out of 2023 is something you've probably done very much as a municipality. Do you want to just unpack that a little bit for us?
Sorry, Jason, I missed a little bit. I was having a hard time. Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Okay, I'm going to avoid the mic. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So Cody talked about assessing risks, and I'm just saying, coming out of the 2023 fire, obviously as a community and a broader region, you've continued to assess your risks. Is there anything you want to unpack with respect to that?
I think just to being open to the ideas of what the ideas are for what the mitigation efforts are. I think one of the things is because our urban municipality, we aren't in control of a lot of the land around us. And that is a challenge for us. So, you know, there was a lot of grant opportunities for our municipality in late 2023, early 2024 with regards to fire guarding, but it's not our land. So we actually can't protect our community in the way that we wished we could have. That's something that we're working through, and we've got some ideas and, you know, having to be creative, think outside the box. And as far as the continued protection of our community, that's one thing that I would say that has posed a challenge for us, and something that we've had to be a little more aggressive about because of we don't want to have a repeat of this happen again. So that's what I would add.
Thank you. I understand that there is a question on the Kuba app, or just one in the audience.
Yeah,
we'll
we
go
have
to
a
Mike.
mic there. Yeah, question?
Just going to do a check to see if you can actually hear this question. Do you mind just doing a check, mic check?
Can they hear me?
Can you folks hear that? Ish.
The lady shaking her head no as asked the questions.
Maybe if you could come to the owl, that may actually help. Talk to the owl.
Hear it back here, so they need to.
Yeah, we'll
Really hard
amplify.
to hear you. Chris.
Yeah, if you can just amplify both to the owl and Chris. Come on up.
So my question is, I'm a legislator from Alaska. Is that what I'm talking to this?
Yes, can you folks on the line hear that?
Okay, and basically you're talking about pivoting, you're talking about reassessment in legislation. So I'm wondering, as a legislator, we kind of look at models across the United States, and we try to conform them to our own situations. Are there models out there that we can look at? And I'm getting the impression that there are. So what are the resources that we could use to build this model for our own state?
So I'm just going to repeat back the question to the broader audience, folks online. I'm hoping you heard, but basically, what are the models out there that we can kind of replicate for success? So, anybody online?
I'll take a shot at it. So I think there's a number of states that have come up with good strategic plans for how you deal with wildfire. And I think Washington in particular has got a good example with both a forest health strategic plan and wildfire strategic plan, and those things work cooperatively together. The challenge for you as a politician is that it's going to take us several decades of doing that work at a very advanced scope and scale to try to minimize the impacts that we're seeing today. So when we see some of the more modern concepts for how you put investments on the landscape, like potential operational delineations or potential control lines, and how we do treatments in and around that to have some confidence we can hold fires in a certain box and protect communities and infrastructure. Those are all good investments, but they take time, they take funding, and there's not a quick solution for something that we've broke over the last 150 years. But there are some places where there's being good progress made, and they have a plan for how they're going to do that over the longer term.
Thanks, Cody.
I just maybe to add to that, you know, I think I can't speak to policy in the United States, but I think where we see some of the greatest change and opportunity is within communities, because there's a little more freedom to try things like our community forest as an example, to demonstrate, different techniques that work, that then could help to create policy. So I think we have to come at it from both sides, right? Is like also to be in touch with what's happening at the on the ground level with practitioners and smaller communities, to see, what's working, and then how we can build up, and use those as demonstrations. So it's a little bit at a time as well, but I think we have to come at it from both sides.
And little did I know, we've got tons of questions coming in. We're just having some other technical glitches. So I'm gonna start firing away. This is fantastic. I'm gonna pose this, and I'm wondering, Jen, maybe this is for you. So agriculture could have a place in fire smarting and community protections that also could help with food security activities like fire grazing or expanded fire guards. Any comments on that?
Absolutely. This is the thing, is like we end up in these situations where it's like either or, right? But no, it's all. And I think, one of the things that I promote a lot, even in the work that I do in my lab, is that we apply a food systems lens to land healing, to restoration, right? And so how can we use farming as an example, or other types of food production, to create resiliency and also address food security issues? But, I had an elder who's well known in the fire world draw a map of how we used to plan our communities or our villages. And there were entire mountains and areas surrounding our villages that didn't have any trees. So Christine, your sort of inclination to want to get rid of trees around community is how we planned our communities. We did not live in the trees, right? And now our communities have grown, like, populations have changed, and that might not be a reality. However, along the Fraser River, where we have ranching and we've got a lot of alfalfa production and all of that, that can be planned as buffers around communities, right? If we need cleared land, then let's use it for agricultural purposes and hug our communities with food, to help keep that wildfire interface from being in there, and also in these areas where we maybe decide, we don't want forestry here anymore, but this is productive land for other possibilities. So I think this is where we need to go, is applying that food systems lens to the solutions, that it's resilience isn't just untouched forest. I think that's also a mistake, and that's where we have people saying well, then where's the economic potential, or, but it's not that we need untouched areas, it's that we need to reimagine how we use them. And agriculture is definitely one of the opportunities that we need to seek in terms of wildfire resilience.
Thanks, Jen. Cody? Any comments on that?
Yeah, I would agree. I think when you look at particularly prescribed grazing, it's a tool in the toolbox. That there's certain field models, particularly like those grass and shrub models, where it just doesn't make sense from a cost effectiveness perspective to try to send crews in there to mow that stuff every single year, when it can be a productive use that generates a food source and reduces fuel. So there's a lot of things that you can do when you look across the landscape about how you manage risk. There's not a silver bullet that's going to fix all of it. It's going to have to be the whole toolbox, and different conditions require different solutions. So hopefully land management planners are considering that. How do we use all of the tools across the landscape through time and space to make sure that we create that resilience? Because it's not realistic to think we can treat everywhere all the time, but we should be treating enough of the landscape at any given time that there's always that resilience. There's always those components and aspects of ecosystem function that are important to us, and we think they'll persist through time because we reduce the risk collectively across the landscape.
Thanks, Cody. We'll throw another one out here. Wildfire prevention and mitigation is expensive and often occurs on public lands. Do you have thoughts on how to blend economic benefits from fuel treatment with ecological and community safety outcomes? Who wants to bite that one? Oh, Paul's gonna take for a shot. Can you hear me okay?
We can't, though.
Good. Then I'll do the questions and nothing for them. All right.
This okay? So, as Cody suggested, it's the modifications, mitigations, the actions are gonna be expensive, and to defray those costs, we have an awful lot of opportunity to actually do thinning treatments that provide a fiber product And we can take the residues, the slab wood at the mill, we can chip it, we can briquette it, we can make biofuels out of it. We can literally merchandise the stuff that comes out of the woods to create these resilience treatments so that there is an added benefit. And right now, there's an awful lot of players in the game that are checking up on the biochar and the biofuel side right now. There's a lot of modeling going on to determine whether or not you can get the stuff out of the woods so that you can actually get to scale with gasification, marine and Jet A kinds of things. So I think those opportunities are really becoming right. I wanted to make an additional comment, George, this goes back to you and it goes back to a comment you made, Jennifer, and that is an awful lot of the solutions that we think about in our political system right now are top down. We apply them top down with top down thinking. And one of the really greatest challenges ahead of us is bottom up thinking, place-based thinking, community thinking. And so community forests and rangelands that are tied to co-planning, co-management, co-production, co-stewardship kinds of models really become the place we need to be thinking about. In a particular place, getting with the community that is influenced and that pays and that benefits or can be harmed by the lack of action, I think is incredibly important. And when you do that, you see that you raise the skids towards positive action because the people who know, who benefit, who can play, who can influence it are at the table with you. And this is where our top-down system often fails us.
Thanks, Paul. Any comments online?
Yeah, I would just add that, I mean, there can be a significant economic benefit from forest management. It doesn't have to be the typical clear cut and replant that we've seen in industrial forestry. That when we look at the forest management that Colville does, and I always use the analogy that logs and money are a byproduct of our forest management goals. What we're managing for is clean water, clean air, big game habitat, cultural plants and medicines. But in reducing that stocking and changing that species composition, we produce a lot of wood because it's just a productive area that grows a lot of wood. So, I mean, you can have a landscape that looks the way your people want it while generating an economy that supports particularly those rural economies, like in places where I presume Christine lives. Looking at it on the map, doesn't look like there's a lot in close proximity to that. But when we look at, say, the wood that Colville produces, the Colville tribe, it goes to the adjacent off-reservation town of Colville and Kettle Falls and supports 3 local mills and all of the people that work there. So, I mean, there's opportunities to not just provide from an ecologic perspective, but also an economic perspective that supports your community. It provides jobs and revenue and provides some safety and resilience to wildfire and other disturbance regimes.
And just to add to that, like I think one of the criticisms that I hear from forestry companies that I work with that are my friends, is like, oh, well, what they're doing at the community forest level can't be replicated. We can't afford it. It's too costly to do it that way. But the fact of the matter is that there's an offloading of costs that happens associated with wildfire management that comes from, forestry practices from that industry, and so it's easy to say the direct or operational costs of changing practice, but we need to start entering into that equation when we're talking with forestry companies is the cost associated with the fire management that we're doing now, that we can't just have those separate. Those are offloaded at every level of government, even at a local government level where we're having to talk about fire safety and spend money on plans, to buffer ourselves from the impacts of that industry. So I think we have to, have a more comprehensive understanding of costs and that they're not just the operational ones.
Christine, any comment from a community perspective that has a number of mills active within your area?
To be fair, I think that I still have a long ways to go into my understanding of how it all works. And that's just me being blunt with my understanding of how it. I understand the mills in that we have. However, the impacts, we are good community partners, but I don't fully know that we have really delved into understanding the industry in the way that I need to in order to maybe provide some of this feedback. And I think I'm learning just as much. I hope that the that others are learning about, just opportunities to kind of think differently about how, when they are stripping, and that's probably not even the correct term, but what does that look like outside of our community? I think sometimes municipal governments potentially, we sometimes stay in our lane, which is not like government, to be fair, and I hope I'm not offending anyone. But we do stay in our lane sometimes, and just that understanding of how we maybe can be at the table for some healthy conversations about how, I appreciate what Cody and Jennifer mentioned with regards to the costs that we're having to take on to protect our community, but how do we maybe look at different ways? And, even just the simple thing that I noted here was prescribed grazing. That's not something I'd considered. We've got some opportunities, maybe around us, that those types of situations can be very attractive, because it's important for our community to be attractive as well. And as soon as we take down trees within our community, it's interesting the reaction we get from our community, but the reality is that it's just not safe, in the areas that we're looking at. So that's all. I'll leave it at that. But I have a lot to learn. That's for sure.
Just
Thanks,
if I
Chris.
could add one more point.
Yes.
That we're starting the conversation here, particularly in Indian country, about what avoided costs are. Not just the cost of suppression and then post-fire rehab, but what are the avoided costs if we do this work ahead of time? And then what risk transfer looks like. So when we like in Jennifer's example, these industries don't want to put in the extra funding to do the work they should have to mitigate the risk they've created. They're just transferring that risk now to the communities or to the people around them because they haven't invested in the things that they should have. So I think that's a collective conversation we need to have. What is the cost across the landscape, and where should those costs go, and who should help contribute to addressing them?
So I think we've got time for one more question, but I'm going to take editorial comment of being the facilitator here, just to jump in from an Alberta-centric perspective. There is actually lots of work going on between the provincial government, municipal governments, and industry to actually fire smart our communities and get ahead of it. I have to give lots of credit to our Minister Todd Lowen. He's been really active trying to preserve and work through some of the issues we're seeing within the communities. Obviously we had the catastrophic fire in Jasper last year, and that's really kickstarted industry, municipal government, provincial government working together. So that work has started in the province. Are we fast enough? No, but I know industry really wants to be part of the solution. So with that, we have a question from the audience. Thank you for allowing me the editorial comment. Go ahead, sir.
I do, thank you. And just to add on to the previous question, actually, and Dr. Hesper, thank you so much for all of your work and leadership in this area for so long. It has been incredibly beneficial to especially the Western states. And I'm a state senator in Oregon. I've been involved in these issues, and the 10-year average in Oregon with so much federal land is 82% of the acres burned are on the federal landscape in Oregon. Of the 18% of fires that are not burned on federal lands, 15% of those acres are burned from fires that come off of federal lands to non-federal lands. And of the 3% of fires that start on non-federal lands, they are kept less. 98% of those fires are kept to less than 100 acres because of all the things that we're talking about here today. I believe that those statistics are comparable to other Western states. So how do organizations like PNWAR, like Council of State Governments West, work together to have our federal government invest in the needed resources so that we can make our communities more fire resilient? I represent Douglas County, arguably the timber capital of the world, in Southwest Oregon, Curry and Coos. And so how do we get our federal government to front load those needed dollars so we can transition our wildland firefighters and the fuel reduction work that you mentioned earlier, and that was so successful in the Fremont-Wainema National Forest, and the prescriptions that you've laid out for almost a decade now, that we know we can get ahead of this. And then in the long term, not only will we have more healthy communities, resilient communities, water, but we'll also have less cost associated with wildfire in the long term.
Thank you, Senator. Paul?
Thank you for your fine comments. I think the short action answer is to invest in proaction rather than reaction. Because declining marginal return on investment with reaction right now. And that means an awful lot of things on the proactive side. We're learning in your district a lot about the fire ecology of those woods. That isn't what we thought. And Marshall's work at Oregon State University, James Johnson's work, basically showing us that fire was a constant companion in those forests. We've treated them like they're asbestos forests. Short answer is, if you want to be able to have active fire, which is coming to your neighborhood, then you actually have to invite the right kind of fire behavior back. And that only comes through proaction. We've recently published some papers in my lab that say that you can't thin and burn your way out of this problem. You actually have to harness the work of wildfire, and it's a bigger stick than thinning and burning. It really is. So that 97%, 98% of fires we're putting out, at least half of them could do excellent work for us. And we're putting them out because they're easy to put out. But if you pockmark the landscape with fires like that, what it does is it changes how fire can flow on the landscape, brings all your communities back on, stuff we talked about in the top. So the key thing is to basically say, what are the key proactive investment areas? And then coalitions of politicians working strongly at the state and federal level, basically saying, we want you to invest bigly in proactive treatments, coast range, Western Cascades, interior conditions.
Thank you for the question, Senator. Thank you, Paul. So we've actually hit the stage where we're going to ask each of our speakers to summarize their comments in 1 to 2 minutes, and then we'll hand over to Keith Heichblatt to do a bit of a summary and call to action for us. So maybe Cody, I'll start with you.
Sure, thanks. And I think that last question was a good primer for this, but I mean, again, this problem wasn't created overnight, so the solution isn't going to be an overnight solution. When we look at in the US, what the investment was made under the Infrastructure and Jobs Act and Inflation Reduction Act, the reality is that was too much money too fast. That if we're going to fix this, we're going to have to think about a systematic, strategic way of investing in these improvements, the capacity to get that work done over the next few decades. So I think when we think about that and how we do that across landscape, across land ownerships, that will hopefully create the coordination or the space for people to think about what those shared priorities and objectives are and how we achieve them, and then think about collectively how we fund them and add capacity to it.
Great, thanks, Cody. Jen, I'll maybe turn to you next.
Sure. I think that there's a tremendous opportunity through, organizations like this to come together to talk about planning at a landscape level, right? We all live in these jurisdictional nightmares that make, managing anything that crosses borders more difficult. Funding, decision-making, power, all of those things. And I think we have to create mechanisms to enable more of that, intergovernmental management of lands and find ways to empower local governments or local land management, like Paul was touching on, as land-based knowledges, because so many fires, I hear local community members, not just Indigenous, like non-Indigenous. I've lived here for, my family's farmed here for 3 generations, 4 generations, and no one listens to us. We're telling them the winds change, this is where we need to find ways to work together and empower the local governments or local people to help shape management, not, in incident command, but also in prevention and how we move forward. And I hope an organization like this can help facilitate that.
Awesome. Thanks, Jen. Christine.
I think from my perspective, it's critically important, I think, to shift the mindset from a local government perspective of simply just protecting your community, but being a part of that solution. And I think that we probably have more tools and more information that we can be helping advocate for to industry, as well as our provincial leaders and federal leaders. I think that what I would say is that 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 needs to be the focus area, especially with just the way the trends that we're seeing. I don't think it's going to change without us being, and I think I really appreciated Jennifer when she said it's going to take some brave leadership here to make a change, and that it's going to from all different levels. So, you know, not only our communities, but also the leaders at every level need to be open and receptive to hearing maybe different ideas that we haven't considered before, and being open to those out of the box thinking that hopefully not only prevent so not prevent fires, because fires, I believe they need to happen, however, but prevent from the risk to the communities in the dire situations that we've seen over the past several years. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine. Paul?
People are smart. They know a lot of things. They've done a lot of things for a long period of time. And we're not connecting to our communities to basically saying, how have you done it across the generations? And we tap into your experience. Who knows this land really well? Because I said that the return of fire is inevitable, one of the things we have to ask ourselves is, how do you want your fire and how do you want your smoke? And we have ways to be able to answer that question profitably and well. I have this thought experiment working in my mind fairly often, and I've had a chance to share it with our national leadership in public land management in the US. Basically saying we spend $5 to $6 billion per year keeping fires out, except the worst 2 or 3%, which are gobbling up Western United States right now. What if we had a proactive workforce that was that size or bigger and resources to cover their bets, and they were regional and national resources, literally 12 months of the year doing proactive burning? In the federal budget, that's couch change. It's not a big thing. $5 to $10 billion a year to be able to do the proactive work would be a big idea, and something that substantial needs to be ongoing in order to overtake the current work of wildfire landscape.
Okay, very thought-provoking conversation. I'll maybe hand it over to Heath to kind of weave us all together in a bit of a close and a call back. So Heath, over to you. All right.
Great. All right, well, I work for the American Forest Resource Council. We are in the 6 western states in the United States here, and focus on the management of our public forests. And it's been really interesting listening to this. And one thing I definitely take away from this is that the laws and policies that are in place between both of these countries are actually very, very different. And I think the situation is very different between Canada and the United States, but we face some of the same challenges in terms of climate change, drought. Just some statistics, and the senator mentioned it. I mean, the state of Oregon, it's 60%, the forests are 60% federally owned. Here in the state of Washington, it's about 44%. Across the western United States, the federal government is the predominant landowner out there in terms of the forest land, and is where we are seeing the biggest forest health crisis, is kind of what was mentioned by the good senator. I have a few slides just to kind of give you an idea. And before I go through it, I want to make it very clear that we've learned a lot in forestry and the way we're doing forestry, particularly in fire-prone ecosystems. So how we manage forests east of the Cascades 30 years ago is very different than how we're managing them now. We took the largest trees, we left the smallest trees. Now we're taking these small and medium trees and leaving the larger fire resilient trees on the landscape. That is the work that we need to bring more of across the Intermountain West. The problem is that we have lost a lot of our milling infrastructure, logging infrastructure, the actual people needed to do the work. And prescribed fire plays a huge role, but until you thin that forest down and get it to a place you can get fire back into that ecosystem, we can't put fire back in there because it would create the next large catastrophic wildfire. So what we have seen in recent decades, I don't have to tell you, on federal lands, mortality in the form of insects, wildfire, is far outstripping anything we're doing in terms of growth. So what that means is we have trees dying either through insects or disease, and they're emitting carbon back into the air, which is the exact opposite of what we want to be doing. I think go to the next slide. And we have seen, we've seen major changes in how we manage the federal forests, national forest system in particular. So In the 1980s, we were harvesting 12 billion board feet of timber from National Forest System lands. We are now at basically 2 billion board feet. So it is an 80 to 90% reduction in the timber harvest off of federal lands. Canada is very different with crown lands and how that system works. But on our federal forests, we have largely walked away from harvest activities, and we have seen, certainly more and more growth. There's more trees on an acre than there was historically on a lot of these areas. And then the next slide. And at the same time, obviously harvest levels have gone down. We've seen the acres burned go up. There's all factors there, climate change, drought, other places going on, but certainly we've seen an inverse relationship take place. We can look at the last slide here. Second to last. So, and then the other thing I just think it's really important to remember as we try to put people into this equation as well, and economics into this equation, we are in one of the best places on God's green earth for forestry and to actually produce wood products, frankly. And we know that global demand is going to go up for wood products as we're trying to actually build more buildings out of wood, not less, as they're carbon friendly, they store carbon as opposed to the alternative. So demand is going to increase significantly. And actually here in the Pacific Northwest, harvest levels are going down significantly on all lands. So in the next slide, you can see Oregon and Washington combined harvest, west side, east side, both is set to continue to go down as changes are made primarily on private lands management. You can see the large dips earlier in the decade from the reduction of federal lands. And then the last slide here, I promise. And then this is Washington specifically, the state of Washington. So this is all lands, private lands, state lands, and federal lands. And you can see harvest levels are down nearly at the lowest going back to 1900. So the reason I mention this is not to make things about board footage, but if you need a mill in your community to do the work on the forest, we've got to be comfortable with understanding we have to go in and do some forest management, that we're going to have to create some, 2x4s and get sold in Home Depot, or, help meet our need for wood products that then make the economics of doing the forest treatments possible. And then take advantage of some of the byproducts, and I think those are some emerging markets that will help with the slash and some of those other things. Because if we can do that thing, we can do that prescribed burn. That is, I think, the best treatment that we're going to have. So I guess that's a call to action. I would say here in the United States, it is hard to do forest management on federal lands. It takes years of going through very complicated processes. There are litigation in some areas. It is not a fast process implementing a forest health treatment on federal lands with the multiple layers you have to go through. So I think understand that as you're a policymaker, you're thinking, how do we engage? How do we get to do responsible forestry to reduce fuel loads, improve wildlife habitat, maintain clean water, all that good stuff on our federal lands. So anyhow, hopefully that works for all that. So Jason,
Great, Keith, thank you very much. And if I could just a huge round of applause to all our panelists, we really informative and rich conversation. And with that, we're a wrap. Thanks, everybody.